Bangladesh has imposed a nationwide curfew and called on the army to help quell protests in which at least 67 people have been killed. Students have been demanding that ministers scrap a quota system which reserves many public sector jobs for the relatives of veterans of the country's war of independence. The UN has said violence against the protesters has been shocking and unacceptable. And a spokesperson for the Bangladesh police has said around 300 Bangladeshi police officers were injured during Friday clashes with demonstrators in multiple locations around the capital, Dhaka. Let's now speak to Naomi Hussain, who is a professor of development studies at the School of Oriental and African Studies. Welcome to the programme. Could you explain a little bit, if you would, the background to these protests and why there is a divide, really, over the legacy of the country's history?
Well, thank you for covering this story. As you said, it's getting very serious. The background really is that the immediate trigger, in fact, for the protests is this demand to reform the quota system in public sector employment. More than half of all the jobs in the Bangladesh civil service are earmarked for particular categories, but the contentious one is really the 30% that's supposed to be filled by families of the freedom fighters. That's people who fought in the Liberation War in 1971, when Bangladesh got its independence from Pakistan. And people believe that this 30% reservation is just another benefit for the followers of the ruling party. But the students were really enraged when the Prime Minister made some sarcastic comments about the protests, saying that these protesters were the children of Razakars, which is a word we use to mean the traitors, the people who collaborated with Pakistan during the Liberation War, and this really inflamed things. But since then, these were initially peaceful protests. They have been attacked since then by the ruling party student wing, the Chhatra League, and then by the police, the border guards, and by the paramilitary group RAB, which is actually sanctioned by the US. So the internet is now down. It has been for over 24 hours. There's a curfew state of emergency. We don't know much about what's getting out, but credible reports of over 100 deaths so far. The broader context, though, and this is really important, I think, is that after a long period of quite successful development and economic growth, Bangladesh has had a cost of living crisis, like much of the rest of the world. 10% inflation, more or less, this year, very high levels of graduate and general unemployment. And really critically, all of this is taking place in a political system that's increasingly authoritarian. The last two elections, at the very least, are not deemed to have been free or fair. The opposition, civil society groups, trade unions, critics, scholars, journalists have all faced intimidation, disappearances, violence and threats. And in this context, I think the protests now have escalated well beyond a demand for quota reform and for accountability and justice. And we're also hearing demands for the resignation of the government and or the Prime Minister.
Well, indeed, it's a reflection now of a broader dissatisfaction. So briefly, where is this heading?
It is very hard to say. I think that the likelihood that the government will topple or the Prime Minister resign as a result of this is very low. The protesters have a lot, I would say almost universal public support. But this has gone very far now. There have been a lot of deaths, there's been a lot of violence. There's also a lot of anger within the government, I think, on the attacks on infrastructure, including the brand new metro stations. Which I think is symbolic of people saying there's all this development, all this growth, but none of it's coming to us. I think that it's very unlikely that we'll see the end of this Awami League regime in the short term, but for sure they've lost their legitimacy, whatever shreds of legitimacy they had. Those have all gone now.
Naomi Hussain, thank you very much.